You tired there, Rook? You tired?
My eyes, I'm staring. My eyes are like doing this.
So I started training grappling and jiu-jitsu in the beginning of 2009 at a gym called Figure 4 in Maysdale that was run by Nico Squazero and Nolan Swanepoel. That was more like orientated to grappling for MMA rather than actual Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And I spent pretty much most of 2009 there, and I kind of like dipped my toes in the competition scene in that era. Then in February 2010, I joined Quantum Tribe under Nathan Ross. And that was more of a traditional Brazilian jiu-jitsu facility. And that's kind of like where my passion for jiu-jitsu really kicked off, right? That was like my first experience of doing gi jiu-jitsu. And yeah, in around about September 2010, I got my blue belt. And at that stage, I had my first MMA fight. After that MMA fight, I decided to stick primarily to Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And yeah, I spent quite a lot of time at Quantum Tribe all the way until about 2013. In 2012, a black belt from Madagascar, Fali Rabarilala, came out. He's a Marcelo Bucau black belt, and Marcelo Bucau was one of Carlson's competitive black belts that represented the Carlson gym back in the day. And yeah, I spent a lot of time with him, trained 6 days a week, most days twice a day. And at that stage, my jiu-jitsu really ramped up. Was competing a lot. And then eventually, in 2012, Fali, while we're still at Quantum Tribe, Fali awarded me my purple belt. And then, yeah, it just kind of kicked off from there. In 2013, 2014, I decided to start my own school out of all the warriors. And I trained a lot of MMA fighters and some jiu-jitsu fighters. And we did pretty well. We had a lot of pro fighters competing in EFC, and we had guys doing pretty well on the jiu-jitsu circuit. In 2015, I decided to move to Durban. I was training a lot with the Novagen guys over the years, even while I was at Quantum Tribe and at World of Warriors. We had a home in Durban, and we used to train there quite regularly. And eventually in 2015, Daryl Moodley awarded me my brown belt, which was quite a big step for me. From there, I didn't really spend too much time in Durban. I lived in Durban for about 3 years and then decided to come back to Johannesburg. When I got back to Johannesburg, I had one of two choices. I could either join a gym or start a gym. So I started a gym, or became part of a team that started a gym. And in that phase, Rich sent out a message saying that he's open to teaching coaches how to coach. And even though we had quite a history from the EFC days, a lot of my fighters fought his fighters, from prelim fights to title fights. Everyone kind of put whatever history we had behind us, and we just focused on doing jiu-jitsu. And my first session here with Rich was a fundamental session, and I was hooked from day one. I was brought into the system, and yeah, I haven't looked back. And that's been April 2018 until now. I've been with Rich training here regularly. So as a white belt, I competed quite a lot. I started competing in 2009, the same year that I started jiu-jitsu. Won a couple of things at white belt, competed a lot over the 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012 period. At one stage, I was trying to keep track of it, but I had well over 100 matches in that period of time, won the majority of them. When I got to purple belt, I had about 30 or 40 matches. I only lost 3 of those matches against some of the most notable competitors on the African continent. And then as a brown belt, I didn't compete as much. Had about 10 matches. I won all 10 of them. But the main highlights is I won FILA Nationals, won FILA Winter Open, won FILA Southern Gauteng Championships. I won the All-Star Grappling League twice. I was the first Submission Kings lightweight champion, first Submission Kings absolute champion, Submission Quest champion. I think my jiu-jitsu career was way more successful than my MMA career. I had about 6 MMA fights, won 4 of them, lost 2 of them. And yeah, when I won my last fight at EFC via submission, I decided to call it a day on getting punched in the face in front of people. And just decided to completely focus on jiu-jitsu and coaching. So when you start jiu-jitsu, like your main focus is always, I want to get to black belt as fast as possible. And that was kind of like the way I approached it for the first 3 years of jiu-jitsu. All I was doing was training as much as I could so I could advance as quickly as I could. That became like very emotionally draining because people would get graded before you, or you would think that you were ready to be graded to the next stripe or belt, and those things didn't happen. And it was a lot of like ups and downs emotionally. And eventually, like after I got my purple belt in 2012, I decided, you know what, I can't actually chase belts anymore and gradings. I just have to chase knowledge and skills, right? So I always think back to like the saying of consistency and persistency, right? So you need to consistently show up to training, consistently try and train hard, right? But you need to be persistent on acquiring skills and acquiring knowledge, right? If you have those two things together, I think your jiu-jitsu journey becomes a lot more enjoyable, becomes a lot more easy for you to pitch up daily for training, and it becomes a lot easier for you to enjoy the entire process. So to get my black belt at this stage, you know, some guys are like, oh, it's been such a long period of time that you've waited to get to your black belt. It hasn't felt that long just because it hasn't been the focus for the majority of the time that I've been training. And to get it from someone like Rich, who only has Rich and Chef, who only have one black belt under them, it's a huge honor. You know, these guys were pioneers in MMA and Jiu-Jitsu locally, and to be part of that lineage, and now to be part of the Cobrinha lineage is something very special to me, and I wouldn't have it any other way. One of my favorite things to do is to go overseas and train at other gyms. It's honestly, it's the best way to kind of give yourself a gauge and a reference point of how you're doing locally and what you're learning locally and how it translates internationally, right? So for me, whenever I go overseas, I make a point of going to the best gyms I can find and training with the best guys I can find in those cities. When I originally started doing that, I obviously wasn't with Rich and Chef, and it was a difficult, you know, I'd go overseas and I'd hang with the other belts that were of my level, but I could never like really step it up to the next level. And ever since coming to Rich and Chef and getting put into like a proper system, every time I go overseas now, my skill set is way more translatable. So when I go overseas, I primarily train with brown belts and black belts at the best gyms across Europe, across America, across Asia. And to find that what we learn here and the skills we acquire here are easily translatable in how we roll overseas, you know? And it's also a good point, I think, guys traveling and doing jiu-jitsu, it's a good way to see like how good is the coaching you're getting locally, right? Personally, I have never come across a coach internationally that coaches as well as Rich coaches. And I'm not trying to be biased or trying to sound like we're better than everybody, but the reality is that you can quickly identify whether you're with a good coach, you know? And the coaching and the systems that we have here in South Africa are world class. So, and I advise any young jiu-jitsu practitioner that you should go out, train at different gyms, go overseas, train, do as much as you can, and let that help grow your jiu-jitsu. So jiu-jitsu is probably one of the hardest things I've ever done in my entire life, right? A lot of like sports came very easy for me. Like I became pretty decent at a lot of sports fairly quickly. But jiu-jitsu was one of those sports where you couldn't just rock up and in a couple of weeks you were kind of hanging with mediocre guys, and then a couple of months later you could kind of hang with better guys. Jiu-jitsu is like years of getting absolutely wrecked by higher belts. So I think the difficulty in jiu-jitsu is what kept me in jiu-jitsu. And even as a brown belt, almost a black belt, there's still days where I pitch up and I'm getting destroyed by people. And there's days I pitch up and I destroy those same people that destroy me. And I think it's that sort of like imperfection that keeps you coming back to jiu-jitsu. And the fact that no matter how much knowledge you acquire about jiu-jitsu, there's still more knowledge to acquire. And it doesn't matter like how many like world-class guys that you can hang with or beat on the mat. There's other world-class guys that will absolutely smoke you. So I think that kind of like duality of I have a lot of knowledge but not enough knowledge. I have a lot of skills but not enough skills kind of like keeps you on the mat, always like persevering and trying to become just a little bit better every week.
Cool. Well,
Awesome. Bye, dank je mensen.